What does it take for someone to become invisible? Not physically, but in every way that matters. When Master Sergeant Ava Rostova stepped off the Osprey into the furnace heat of forward operating base Peregrine, she carried three things with her. A single duffel bag, a crisp, unfaded uniform without combat patches, and a secret so heavy it could crush mountains. But nobody saw the secret. They only saw what they wanted to see. A clerk, a paper pusher. Someone who didn't belong at the tip of the spear. The propeller wash kicked up a storm of dust as her boots hit the ground, and in that moment something was stolen from her. Not her belongings, not her rank, her name. On the manifest, on the transfer orders, she was just a number. 13419Z Master Sergeant, Armament Logistics Specialist. The grunts who watched her arrive filed her away instantly under a category they knew well: rear echelon. Someone from the comfortable rear who'd been sent forward to tick a box on a deployment roster. Someone who'd never tasted real combat. Someone who didn't matter. The first theft was subtle, the kind you don't notice until it's already gone. They didn't spit at her, they didn't curse her presence. They simply looked through her as if she were made of glass, as if she were furniture in a room nobody bothered decorating. The chow hall was the worst. Conversations that hummed with energy would fall silent when she approached, then resume the moment she passed. Not out of respect, out of indifference. She was an anomaly. A senior non-commissioned officer without a platoon, without a history they could trace through the usual channels of shared hardship and common enemies. Her presence was a question nobody bothered to ask aloud. And perhaps that was the cruelest part. Being ignored doesn't hurt like a punch to the face. It's slower. It seeps in like cold water through cracked boots. It whispers that you don't exist, that your years of service mean nothing, that all your scars are invisible because they're worn on the inside. But Ava Rostova had learned long ago how to carry weight no one else could see. Fob Peregrine was a monument to attrition, a scab of HESCO barriers and sun-bleached shipping containers clinging to hostile rock. Dust was the fifth element here, a fine, gritty powder that worked its way into everything. Weapon oil, sealed food packets, the back of your throat. While others sought shade and complained about the call to prayer that woke them at 4 in the morning, Rostova walked the perimeter. Her gait was economical, her head on a quiet swivel. She wasn't sightseeing. She was mapping fields of fire, knotting the sag in one section of concertina wire. The blind spot near the western watchtower. The subtle depression in the earth 100 meters out that could hide a mortar team. This wasn't her first rodeo. It wasn't even her 10th, but nobody knew that. Nobody asked. Her assigned bunk was in a transient container, a metal box shared with a rotating cast of mechanics and communication specialists. She claimed the bottom rack, stowed her single duffel with austere precision, and went to the armory. The rifle she was issued was an M4A1 that had seen better days. The finish was worn to a dull gray on the pistol grip and receiver. The forward assist had a sticky reluctance. The stock rattled with a loose, tinny sound. The armorer, a corporal barely old enough to shave, slid it across the counter with a grunt. "Treat her nice. She's seen more action than most of the brass." Rostova didn't reply. She took the weapon, her hands moving over it with an intimacy that was unsettling to watch. Because here's the thing about soldiers who have been to the edge and back. They don't talk about it, they just know. They know a weapon the way a pianist knows keys, by touch, by memory, by instinct. Back in her bunk, she laid out her cleaning mat. The other soldiers in the container were playing cards, the slap of cardboard a counterpoint to the distant drone of a generator. They paid her no mind. She field-stripped the rifle in a fluid sequence of movements so fast it was almost a blur. Click, snap, slide, the bolt carrier group, the charging handle, the buffer and spring, all laid out in perfect order. She cleaned every component, not with the bored duty of a soldier checking a box, but with the focused attention of a surgeon preparing instruments. One of the card players, a young specialist, glanced over. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second at the sheer speed and efficiency before he quickly looked back at his hand, pretending he hadn't seen a thing. Because sometimes you see something that doesn't fit the narrative you've built in your head, and it's easier to look away than to question what you think you know. She wasn't just cleaning a tool, she was learning its soul, its flaws, its potential. This subtle, unremarked upon expertise was the first clue, a whisper of the storm to come, but storms don't announce themselves with thunder right away. They start with a change in pressure, a shift in the wind, a feeling in your bones that something's coming. Why do powerful people feel threatened by silence? Colonel Marcus Thorne prided himself on running a tight ship. Fob Peregrine was his command, and he viewed it as a chessboard. Every soldier was a piece with a defined role. Infantry were his pawns and knights, artillery his rooks, intelligence his bishops. He liked his pieces predictable. Master Sergeant Ava Rostova was not predictable. She was a queen that had appeared on the board in the wrong square, and it annoyed him deeply. He reviewed her file for the third time in his air-conditioned command module, the only reliably cool place on the entire base. The document was an exercise in frustration. It was thin, anemic, insultingly redacted. Large black bars obscured entire paragraphs, leaving behind a skeletal record of promotions and mandatory training courses. Her specialty, armament logistics, was so broad as to be meaningless. "Get her in here," he ordered his aide. Rostova entered the office a few minutes later. She moved with a stillness that was unnerving, no clicking heels, no shuffling, just presence. She stood before his desk at a perfect position of parade rest, her gaze fixed on the wall just over his left shoulder. "Master Sergeant," Thorne began, steepling his fingers. He didn't offer her a seat. "I've reviewed your transfer orders. I confess I'm at a loss. Your file says you're a logistics specialist. Yet you've been assigned to a forward operating base under my command without a specific role or unit attachment." He paused, letting the silence hang. "We are not a holding pen for personnel in transit. We are the tip of the spear." He let the weight of those words settle, expecting an explanation, perhaps a hint of unease. He received neither. "Understood, sir," Rostova said. Her voice was level, without inflection, a flat line of military professionalism. "Do you?" Thorne leaned forward, his chair creaking. "Because I don't. I have infantry platoons running at 80% strength, and you, a senior NCO with a logistics designation, are sent here to do what exactly? Count bullets." His tone was sharp, a scalpel of condescension intended to cut her down to size. He saw her as a bureaucratic error, a problem sent down from higher headquarters that didn't understand the realities on the ground. Someone taking up space that a real operator could fill. "I go where I'm ordered, Colonel," she replied, her expression unchanged. The simplicity of her answer was more irritating than a dozen excuses. It was a brick wall of military protocol. He couldn't fault the logic, but it gave him no purchase. He had no grounds to send her back, but he could certainly put her where he felt she belonged. "Very well, Master Sergeant. If you're here to manage logistics, then you'll manage them. The West Sector Supply Depot, Warehouse 4, is a rat's nest. Years of accumulated, uncatalogued material. I want a full wall-to-wall inventory. Every crate, every box, every single item. You will report your progress to the supply officer daily. Is that understood?" It was a deliberately menial, soul-crushing task. Warehouse 4 was a sweltering metal tomb filled with forgotten junk. A place where careers went to die. Assigning a master sergeant to such a task was a clear and public statement of his assessment of her worth. "Yes, sir," Rostova said. There was no hint of disappointment, no flicker of anger in her eyes, just acceptance. "Dismissed." She executed a crisp about-face and walked out. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Thorne alone with the hum of the air conditioner. He felt a flash of victory, the satisfaction of putting a confusing piece back in its box. But a nagging sliver of doubt remained. Her calm was too absolute, her discipline too perfect. It was as if he had just tried to intimidate a statue, and the statue had won. Warehouse 4 was exactly as the colonel had intended, a purgatory of dust and neglect. Crates of obsolete radio parts from a decade-old conflict sat next to pallets of hardened rations that had expired during the previous administration. The air was thick with the smell of old canvas, machine oil, and baked metal. For 2 weeks, this became Rostova's world. She worked with a methodical, uncomplaining diligence that baffled the junior soldiers assigned to help her. They would arrive in the morning, groaning at the heat, and find her already there, a clipboard in hand, systematically working her way through a new section. She spoke little, issuing clear, concise orders. By the end of the first week, the chaos had begun to transform into order. Items were sorted, labeled, cataloged. The junior enlisted started to look at her differently, not with respect yet, but with a grudging acknowledgement that she was actually getting it done. But respect built on competence alone is fragile. It needs a foundation, and that foundation was about to be shattered by the second theft. Can you steal from someone who has nothing left to lose? The rifle range at Fob Peregrine was a crude affair, a stretch of hard-packed earth backed by a natural berm of rock and sand, target frames made from scrap wood, a concrete firing line cracked and stained by years of abuse. The annual marksmanship competition was one of the few traditions that brought the entire base together. Bragging rights were on the line, unit pride, a brief escape from the grinding monotony of deployment. Sergeant First Class Jennings and Staff Sergeant Cole were the golden boys of Alpha Company. Both were infantry. Both had combat badges. Both carried themselves with the easy confidence of men who believed they were the best shots on the base. They'd won the past two competitions. When they saw Rostova's name on the competitor roster, they laughed. Not quietly, out loud, in front of others. "The supply clerk's shooting," Jennings said, elbowing Cole. "What's she gonna use, a stapler?" The joke spread through the morning formation like wildfire. By noon, half the base had heard some version of it, but Rostova said nothing. She simply showed up to the pre-competition equipment check with her issued M4. She laid it on the table for inspection. The range safety officer, a grizzled gunnery sergeant who'd seen 3 decades of service, looked it over with a practiced eye. "You're good to go, Master Sergeant," he said, stamping her form. She nodded and walked away. That's when Jennings and Cole made their move. It was supposed to be a prank, a bit of harmless fun. They waited until the range cleared out that evening, until the shadows stretched long and the guards were rotating shifts. Then they slipped into the armory. Rostova's rifle was easy to identify. It had a small piece of rigger's tape with her name on the stock. They took it, hid it in a storage locker filled with old training aids, and they laughed about it over chow that night. They expected her to panic, to complain, to make a scene, to prove she was everything they thought she was, weak, unprepared, out of her depth. But the next morning, when she arrived at the range and discovered her rifle was missing, Rostova did something they didn't expect. She said nothing. She walked away from the firing line, straight to the motor pool, and that's when the real story began. Because some people break when you steal from them, others rebuild. And a rare few, they build something better from the wreckage you left behind. What do you do when the system fails you? When the people around you decide you're not worth their time, their respect, their basic decency? Do you scream? Do you quit? Or do you become something they never saw coming? The motor pool at Fob Peregrine was a graveyard of broken machines. Humvees with blown engines, MRAPs with shredded tires, a sad collection of parts cannibalized from vehicles that would never roll again. Specialist Diaz, a stocky mechanic with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails, was the king of this scrap heap. He looked up from the transmission he was rebuilding and saw Master Sergeant Rostova standing at the edge of the bay. "Help you, Master Sergeant?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "I need parts," she said simply. "Rifle parts." Diaz raised an eyebrow. "We don't exactly stock those here. You'd need the armory." "The armory doesn't have what I need," she replied. Her tone wasn't desperate. It was matter-of-fact, clinical. "I need improvised components, scrap metal, anything that can be machined or welded." Diaz studied her for a long moment. He'd been in the army long enough to recognize when someone was serious. And there was something in her eyes, not panic, not anger, just cold, focused determination. "You building something?" he asked. "Rebuilding," she corrected. "Someone took my rifle, competitions in 48 hours. Most people would have gone to the chain of command, filed a report, made noise, but she wasn't interested in justice. She was interested in results." Diaz grinned. "Now that's interesting. What do you need?" She walked him through the motor pool, her eyes scanning the piles of discarded parts with the precision of a surgeon selecting instruments. a section of steel tubing from a damaged exhaust system, springs from a seat suspension, a trigger assembly from a broken pneumatic tool. Diaz watched in fascination as she mentally cataloged each piece, her hands moving over them, testing weight and flexibility. "You know what you're doing?" he asked. "I know enough," she said, and that was the understatement of the century. For the next 2 days, Rostova disappeared into the motor pool. She worked through the night under a single bare bulb, the clang of metal on metal echoing in the darkness. Diaz stayed with her, providing tools, offering suggestions, but mostly just watching in awe as she transformed junk into function. She didn't have a mill or a lathe. She had a bench grinder, a welder in her hands. She fabricated a lower receiver from steel plate, grinding it down with painstaking precision. She adapted the trigger assembly from the pneumatic tool, modifying springs until the pull weight was exactly where she needed it. She used the exhaust tubing to reinforce the barrel shroud. Every piece was measured by eye, tested by feel, adjusted and readjusted until it fit. "Where'd you learn to do this?" Diaz asked around midnight on the second night. She didn't look up from her work. "You pick things up," she said quietly. And that was all she would say, because the truth was locked behind redacted files and classified missions, behind memories of remote mountain passes where supply lines didn't exist and survival meant building tools from wreckage, behind the faces of teammates who died waiting for reinforcements that never came. She'd learned because she'd had to. Because in the places she'd been, failure wasn't an option. By the morning of the competition, she had created something ugly, brutal, functional, a rifle that looked like it had been assembled in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The welds were rough, the finish was non-existent, but when she loaded a magazine and chambered a round, it cycled smooth as silk. Diaz stared at it in disbelief. "That actually works." She didn't smile, she simply nodded. "It'll do." But what she'd built wasn't just a weapon, it was a message. "You can take what I have, but you can't take what I am. You can dismiss me, ignore me, mock me, but I will still show up. I will still compete. And I will do it with a rifle I built from your garbage." The morning of the competition arrived with the usual desert heat. Competitors gathered at the range, checking equipment, loosening up. Jennings and Cole were there, cocky as ever, their polished rifles gleaming in the sun. When Rostova walked up to the firing line with her improvised weapon, the laughter started immediately. "What the hell is that?" someone called out. "Looks like something from a junkyard," another voice added. Cole elbowed Jennings, whispering loud enough for others to hear. "She actually showed up with scrap metal. This is gonna be embarrassing." But the range safety officer walked over, inspected the weapon, checked the serial numbers she'd stamped into the receiver. He looked at her with something close to respect. "This passes safety. You're cleared to compete, Master Sergeant." The laughter died down a bit, not much, but enough. The competition had 3 stages: marksmanship at various distances, speed drills, and practical scenarios. Rostova shot last in her group. She approached the line with her ugly rifle. She took a knee. She adjusted her sling, and then she began to shoot. The first target was at 200 meters. She fired 5 rounds. 5 holes appeared in the center mass, grouped so tight you could cover them with a playing card. The range fell silent. At 300 meters she did it again. 5 rounds, 5 hits, dead center. At 500 meters, in a crosswind that had other shooters struggling, she put 3 rounds through the X-ring. By the time she moved to the speed drills, people had stopped laughing. They were watching, really watching, because what she was doing shouldn't have been possible, not with that rifle, not with equipment she'd literally built from scrap. Jennings shot a respectable score. Cole did slightly better. Both were confident they'd placed in the top 3. But when Rostova's final score was posted, the range went dead silent. She'd outshot everyone by a margin that wasn't even close. She hadn't just won. She dominated, set a new base record, with a rifle held together by welds and determination. Jennings and Cole stood frozen. The prank they'd pulled suddenly wasn't funny anymore. It was humiliating for them. Specialist Diaz, watching from the back of the crowd, felt a chill run down his spine. He'd helped her build that weapon. He'd seen the precision, the knowledge, the absolute mastery, and a thought occurred to him, one that made his stomach tighten. Who the hell is she really? Have you ever watched someone's world collapse in real time? Colonel Thorne was in his office when his aide knocked on the door. "Sir, you need to see this." The aide handed him a tablet showing the competition results. Thorne stared at the screen. Master Sergeant Rostova, first place, by a landslide. "She shot with what?" Thorne asked. "A rifle she built herself, sir, from scrap parts, in the motor pool over 2 days." Thorne set the tablet down slowly. Something cold settled in his chest. He dismissed her, buried her in a warehouse, and she'd not only endured it, she just humiliated the best shooters on his base, with improvised equipment. That level of skill wasn't learned in a classroom. It wasn't taught in basic marksmanship courses. It came from years of hard-won experience in places that didn't make it into official records. He pulled up her file again. This time he didn't just skim the visible parts. He started calling in favors, reaching out to contacts at higher headquarters, asking the right questions. It took 3 hours and a dozen phone calls, but eventually someone told him where to look, not in the main file, in the classified annexes, the ones that required special clearance to access. What he found made his blood run cold. Master Sergeant Ava Rostova had not been a logistics specialist for most of her career. She'd been attached to Special Operations Command, multiple deployments to non-permissive environments, black sites, classified missions in denied areas. Her real specialty wasn't counting bullets. It was using them, extremely effectively. The annexes detailed operations in places that officially didn't exist, missions that were described in chillingly vague terms. Exemplary performance during direct action operations, critical asset in unconventional warfare. She'd been attached to ghost organizations, units whose names were just strings of letters and numbers. Then Thorne found the report that changed everything. 5 years prior, Hindu Kush Mountains, a small special reconnaissance team compromised, nearly wiped out. The sole survivor had held a remote mountain pass against an overwhelming enemy force for 72 hours, alone, preventing them from recovering sensitive intelligence from the bodies of fallen teammates. The report detailed improvised weapons, channeled fields of fire, a ferociously effective defense that convinced the attacking force they were facing a much larger unit. The surviving operator was cited for extreme valor. The report listed her call sign: Warden. Thorne leaned back in his chair, cold sweat on his brow. They called her Warden, not because she was a guard, but because she could turn any piece of ground into an inescapable prison for her enemies. The reassignment to logistics was a mandatory cool-down period, a way for an operator who'd seen too much to decompress in a low-stress environment before being recalled to the shadows. He hadn't been sent a clerk, he'd been sent a living legend, and he had tasked her with counting spare parts in a warehouse. At that same moment, out in the motor pool, old Chief Warrant Officer Daniels was watching Rostova clean her scrap rifle. He'd seen her performance at the range, and a half-forgotten memory had been nagging him. He squinted, pieces clicking into place. He walked over to Specialist Diaz. "You know who that is?" the old chief said, his voice low. Diaz shook his head. "Master Sergeant Rostova. Kid, I was attached to a logistics hub in Bagram years back. We got whispers, ghost stories about some of the operators who passed through. There was one they talked about, a woman who could build a machine gun out of a broken-down Toyota. They said she single-handedly held off an entire company of insurgents in the Korangal Valley. Thought it was just a myth." He paused, looking at Rostova with a new kind of reverence. "They had a name for her. They called her the Warden." Diaz felt his mouth go dry. He'd been joking with her, offering her water like she was just another NCO, but she wasn't. She was something else entirely, something forged in fire that would have broken anyone else. And suddenly the scrap rifle made perfect sense. She hadn't built it because she had to. She'd built it because she could. Because for someone like her, obstacles weren't roadblocks. They were just raw materials. What does redemption look like when you've done nothing wrong? The awards ceremony was an informal affair. Competitors and a few dozen onlookers gathered near the flagpole as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. The air was cooling. The mood was subdued, lacking the usual boisterous energy of such events. Colonel Thorne stood before them, a simple wooden plaque in his hands. He announced the third-place winner, a young sniper who accepted his congratulations with a humbled nod. Second place went to a platoon sergeant from Alpha Company, a man widely considered the best shot on the base before today. He managed a weak smile. Both men received polite, scattered applause. Then Thorne cleared his throat. The formation fell completely silent. First place, he announced, his voice carrying a new weight of gravity and formality. With a score that has set a new standard for marksmanship on this fob, Master Sergeant Ava Rostova. The silence that followed was not the silence of mockery or disbelief. It was the silence of pure, unadulterated awe. Rostova stepped forward from the line. She moved with the same quiet dignity she always had, her face betraying no emotion, no pride, no vindication, just presence. She halted before the colonel and rendered a sharp salute. Thorne looked at her, and for the first time he wasn't looking at a subordinate or a problem. He was looking at a warrior. He saw the years of discipline etched into her posture, the deep, ancient knowledge in her calm eyes. He saw the warden. He didn't just hand her the plaque. He returned her salute, holding it for a long, deliberate moment. Then he extended his hand. That was the finest display of marksmanship and fieldcraft I have ever had the honor of witnessing, Master Sergeant, he said, his voice clear and resonant. The words were not just praise. They were an apology, an acknowledgement that he'd been wrong, that he'd let assumptions blind him to what was standing right in front of him. As Rostova took the plaque, Thorne stepped back and brought his hand up in a second salute. This one was different. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture of a commander going through motions. It was the slow, formal, deeply personal salute of a soldier acknowledging a peer of profound skill and courage. It was a sign of ultimate respect. Inspired by his lead, every officer and NCO in the formation followed suit. Hands snapped to brows in a wave of unified motion. The entire assembly, from company commanders to platoon sergeants, stood saluting the quiet woman they had dismissed as a clerk. In the back of the formation, Sergeants Jennings and Cole stood rigid, their eyes locked on the dusty ground in front of them. The colonel's salute was a public coronation, and their petty crime was now an act of blasphemy against a newly recognized deity of war. Their humiliation was absolute, and it was delivered in the ringing silence of respect they could never hope to earn. They'd stolen her rifle thinking they were taking away her chance to compete. Instead, they'd given her a stage to reveal exactly who she was, and that revelation burned brighter than any spotlight. A small celebration that evening was in the mess tent. Second and third place winners were buying rounds of non-alcoholic beer. Stories of the day's events were already beginning their journey into base legend, but the guest of honor was not there. Master Sergeant Ava Rostova was back in the motor pool. She was alone under the same single bear bulb that had illuminated her work the night before. The celebration, the accolades, the public reversal of opinion, none of it held any real value for her. They were external validations, as ephemeral as the dust motes dancing in the cone of light. What was real was the work. On the bench before her was the scrap rifle, field stripped, its ugly, functional components laid out on a clean rag. With meticulous care, she cleaned each piece. She didn't use standard-issue CLP. She used a specialized graphite lubricant she carried in her personal kit, applying it with a small, stiff brush to the contact points of the trigger group and bolt. Her original M4, which had been anonymously and sheepishly returned to its spot in the rifle rack that afternoon, sat untouched in her locker. It was a fine tool, mass-produced and reliable, but this one, this brute of welded steel and salvaged parts, was hers. It was an extension of her will, a physical manifestation of her ethos: create order from chaos, precision from junk, victory from sabotage. She ran an oiled cloth over the rough, welded seam of the receiver, her scarred but steady hands treating the ugly weapon with a reverence she would never show a factory-made rifle. The hulking shadow of Specialist Diaz appeared at the edge of the light. He said nothing. He simply walked forward and placed a bottle of ice-cold water on the workbench, condensation beading on the plastic. It was a quiet offering, an acknowledgement that transcended rank and words. Rostova paused her work, picked up the bottle, and gave him the same sharp, single nod of thanks she'd given the night before. Diaz nodded back and melted into the shadows, leaving her to her ritual. Because some bonds aren't built with words, they're built with respect, with recognition, with the understanding that greatness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just shows up, does the work, and lets the results speak. The final image of her on Fob Peregrine, the one that would anchor the legend of the warden, was this: a lone woman in a pool of light, her hands moving with quiet, surgical precision, caring for the weapon she had forged from nothing, not because anyone asked her to, not because anyone was watching, but because that's who she was. The base had tried to make her invisible. They'd stolen her name, her dignity, her rifle, but you can't steal what someone builds inside themselves. You can't take away years of earned skill. You can't erase the kind of strength that's forged in mountains where help never comes and survival means becoming your OWN Chinese letter. Her dignity was a fortress she had built herself, stone by stone, scar by scar, mission by mission, and the respect of those around her was a flag she had just silently raised, not by demanding it, not by fighting for it, but by simply being undeniable. Because in the end, that's what separates the truly exceptional from everyone else. The exceptional don't need your permission to be great. They don't need your approval to prove their worth. They just need you to get out of the way and watch. Rostova never spoke about what she'd done in the mountains. She never wore her classified commendations. She never told the stories that would have made her a hero in their eyes from day one, because she understood something fundamental about respect. Real respect isn't given. It's revealed. It's not about making people believe in you. It's about showing them who you've always been, even when they refuse to see it, even when they tried to bury you in warehouses and stolen rifles, even when the world decided you were invisible. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. It shows up in motor pools at midnight building rifles from scrap metal. It endures dismissal without complaint. It transforms insults into fuel. And when the moment comes when the world finally decides to watch, dignity doesn't gloat, it doesn't lecture, it simply performs, flawlessly, undeniably, unstoppably. Master Sergeant Ava Rostova, the warden, understood this truth in her bones. She'd learned it in valleys where the only voice was the wind and the only witness was the mountain. She'd carried it through deployments that didn't officially exist and missions that would never make it into history books. And she'd brought it with her to Fob Peregrine, wrapped in silence and worn like armor. They'd tried to steal from her, but theft only works when someone has something to lose. And Rostova had long ago learned that the things that truly mattered couldn't be taken, only revealed. One perfect shot at a time.